human rights, human needs. Have you ever been really hungry? Are you really hungry now? When was the last time you ate? I'm going to be talking about food as a human right, and that sounds so nice and abstract, but I want to start with us remembering what it feels like to be simply hungry. And then try to imagine what it feels like to go hungry for days. And then add the anxiety of not knowing for sure when you're going to eat next. When we set out on Cape Cod, the United States of America, to talk about hunger honestly, we have to acknowledge that we speak and think from a privileged position compared to the rest of the world. A privilege that easily blinds us to the suffering of the billions of people who do not have what is called food security. That is, knowing where the next meal is coming from. So if you have never visited a refugee camp, if you have never walked a mile down a dusty road to fetch a few gallons of drinkable water for your family, if you have never thinned the porridge to make it go around the table, you can visit all these things and more in your imagination as we talk about food as a human right. This summer at our Religion and Science Conference on the World Food Crisis, we had one speaker who was a human rights activist from Boston, and who spoke with great passion on food as a human right. And I got up at the question period and said I was having trouble with the notion because of these certain factors in my own activist background that I'm going to detail later. She advised me to read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this sermon is the result. It is about time I read that declaration because I am the Chatham Town representative for the Barnstable County Human Rights Commission. And every year we celebrate that document on December 10th, International Human Rights Day. It's high time I read it. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is almost as old as I am. It was ratified 6 months after I was born in December of 1948. The picture on the front of your order of service shows one of its proud mothers, former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, beaming at the product of the labors of herself and an international committee. The idea of inherent universal human rights has many roots. The Magna Carta, the U.S. Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, the U.S. Bill of Rights. In his State of the Union speech in 1941, Franklin Roosevelt articulated 4 freedoms as fundamental: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from fear, and freedom from want. Later in World War II, the Allies adopted these 4 freedoms as their aims in the war. And that war forged the world we live in today. In particular, the United Nations was formed out of the horror of that war, a second try at establishing a viable international body which might avoid a third world war. And if that is its main goal, so far I must say it is working, though not perfectly. A centerpiece of the UN setup is a respect for human rights. The Charter of the UN, signed in 1945, states as one of the 4 purposes of the organization, quote, promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion, unquote. The Declaration of Human Rights 3 years later was an attempt to articulate those universal human rights, the protection of which was one of the aims of the organization. Many of the provisions of the Universal Declaration are directly tied to freedoms denied by the totalitarian governments which had just been defeated at that time. For example, we read in our EVIL workshop this last week, the Hannah Arendt's account of Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem, and she talked a lot about the Nazis' legal strategy, one of which was to declare all Jews stateless. And that allowed that meant that no government had a legal concern with them. which was devastating, of course, for the Jews. And as a result of that, in the Declaration of Human Rights, one of the rights is every person has a right to a nationality. The Declaration also goes further and enunciates in Article 25 a right to fulfillment of basic human needs. Quote, everybody has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family, including food, clothing, housing and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. Unquote. Now, the Universal Declaration was passed by the fledgling United Nations General Assembly by a vote of 48 in favor, 0 opposed, and 8 abstentions. The abstentions consisted chiefly of the member states of the Soviet Union, Saudi Arabia, and South Africa. Eleanor Roosevelt did not want it adopted as a treaty having the force of law, but as a declaration where she thought it would have more persuasive power, like the U.S. Declaration of Independence and Bill of Rights. In this, she proved to be farsighted. But the Declaration did spawn other documents which were enacted with the force of law. There is now in force an International Bill of Rights consisting of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and its 2 optional protocols. However, these daughter documents, as I'm going to call them, are only binding on the countries that have ratified them. One of these daughter treaties, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, has a more detailed provision on the right to food. After expressing the general right to an adequate supply of food, it further provides, quote, the states parties to the present covenants, recognizing the fundamental right of everyone to be free from hunger, shall take individually and through international cooperation the measures, including specific programs, which are needed, A, to improve methods of production, conservation, and distribution of food by making full use of technical and scientific knowledge, by disseminating knowledge of the principles of nutrition, and by developing or reforming agrarian systems in such a way as to achieve the most efficient development and utilization of natural resources. B, taking into account the problems of both food importing and food exporting countries to ensure an equitable distribution of world food supplies in relation to need, end quote. Though the U.S. signed this treaty when it came out in 1977, it has never ratified it. And the U.S. failure to ratify puts us in a very small company. All the other developed countries have ratified. Now, the U.S. has ratified the other major covenant growing out of the Universal Declaration, that is, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This latter document protects such things as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and freedom of assembly. Why this distinction? Why would it ratify one and not the other? The United Nations point man on the right to food is a fellow named Olivier de Schutter, and his title is Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. I love that title, Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food. It is his job to promote a universal right to food and to make that right operational in different national and international contexts. 2 years ago, he was interviewed by food activist Anna Lappé for, of course, The Nation magazine. And she asked him why the U.S. had not ratified the Covenant on Economic Rights. His response is as follows. It's extremely difficult to get the concept of the right to food across in the United States because of your constitutional tradition that sees human rights as negative rights, rights against government, not positive rights that can be used to oblige government to take action to secure people's livelihoods. So embedded is this in your constitutional culture that the concept that social and economic rights are real rights is generally not accepted. While human rights to health, education, social security, or food are guaranteed to a certain extent through legislation, they are still seen as suspect. Indeed, the protective role of government is denounced as paternalistic, and even, following Hayek, as paving the way for totalitarianism. Such right could empower courts against the executives in ways perceived as undemocratic. End quote. I think our rapporteur really hits the nail on the head here. Why can't the U.S. Congress pass a farm bill? Because the House insisted on stripping away the food stamp provisions, which have been part of the farm bill for decades. And we're looking at a disaster if the current law expires, as it is scheduled to do September 30th, the end of this month. The food stamp program, our effort to directly feed the hungry in this country, has become a political football. By articulating this position, DeShooter was not endorsing it. As he goes on to say, real freedom can be achieved only when individuals are shielded against the most serious exclusions caused by the market. Rights have been invented precisely because majorities can act abusively, failing to respect the needs of minorities and the underprivileged. I must say this echoes a debate within my own American soul. I have to this point made a distinction between human needs and human rights. Back in the 1970s and 80s, I was active with the ACLU and even made it to the national board of that worthy organization. And I was consistently conservative on what sorts of rights should be recognized as civil rights. The core to me was the political rights, like freedom of speech, voting, freedom to petition the government for redress of grievances. Since these individual rights are by definition counter to the will of the majority, I would always argue that the ACLU had its hands full defending them without expanding them to include substantive rights like the right to food, water, shelter, or a decent income. Are all human rights, are all human needs human rights? This is a question both moral and political. On the moral side, many of our religious traditions urge us to feed the hungry. In the book of Genesis, when God asks Cain, where is his brother, Cain responds, am I my brother's keeper? The question echoes throughout the biblical tradition. Isaiah says, if you offer your food to the hungry and satisfy the needs of the afflicted, you should be like a watered garden, like a spring whose waters never fail. In the Christian tradition, we have Jesus sharing his table with tax collectors, prostitutes, Gentiles, and sinners. We have the story of the Good Samaritan, set up by Jesus' observation that the essence of the law was to love one's neighbor as oneself, and this parable told to answer the question, who is my neighbor? This question, which echoes Cain's question of whether he is his brother's keeper, is answered in the widest possible manner. Your neighbor is the one that you have regarded as your enemy. Even to your enemies, you owe the duty of succor, of taking them in, feeding them, seeing that they're taken care of. In the Judgment Day account in Matthew 25, as I read, when the Son of Man will come in all his glory and divide all the people as a shepherd divides the sheep from the goats, the Son of Man says to the righteous people, come inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the beginning of the world, for I was hungry and you gave me food. And the righteous ask him, when did we see you hungry and give you food? And the Son of Man responds, inasmuch as you have done it unto one of the least of these my brethren, you have done it unto me. And when Jesus appears to Simon after his resurrection in the Gospel of John, he tells Simon, feed my sheep. In Islam as well, there's a moral duty for those with means to sustain their fellows who are less well off. Giving, zakat, is one of the 5 pillars of Islam. One commentator on the Quran says, so we find in Surah Al-Balad, while describing the virtuous path, which often appears as a steep or difficult path, it says, that steep uphill road. It is the freeing of a slave or the feeding on a day of hunger an orphan relative or a needy person lying in the dust. In Buddhism, you have the hungry ghosts, the spirits of your ancestors, which hang around your dinner table and are never satisfied. In other words, we find in the world's great religions a strong moral duty to feed the hungry. And in Christianity, that duty extends to all who are in God's family. The hymn we sang, Let Freedom Span Both East and West, originally the title was, the tune is to an African American spiritual, In Christ there is no East or West, echoing one of the principal passages from St. Paul. There's neither Jew nor Greek, Jew nor Gentile, there's neither male nor female, neither slave nor free. In Christ all are equal. The first hints of a really universalistic ethic in Christianity. Compare the UU7 principles. They're in your hymn book after the title page. There's a lot in there about inherent worth and dignity, democratic processes, freedom of conscience. There is stated a goal of world community with, quote, peace, liberty, and justice for all, unquote, but no food. There's nothing in our principles that says everyone has the right to a square meal. And it's hard to maintain that inherent worth and dignity if your stomach is grumbling. But of course, we UUs do have many projects to feed the hungry. In this church, since I've been here, the children have raised money in this congregation for the Heifer Project. And we have regularly served meals at the congregate house and collected donations for the food pantry. But there is a tradition of individualism in America which says, I am not my brother's keeper. I remember an example from my law school class in torts of civil wrongs. If you're walking on a dock by a lake, and there's a drowning person in the water just a few yards away, and there's a life ring on the dock, which would save the drowning person, you have no legal duty to throw the life ring, unless some action of yours has caused the person to be in the water. That seems very harsh. And our religious consciences would tell us that if we have the opportunity to save another's life, we must take it. But the law is otherwise. Now, evolution has endowed us with brain structures for empathy. We have the so-called mirror neurons, which will fire when we are suffering and will fire when we see someone else suffer. Human young are dependent on adults for food for a longer period of their lives than any other animal. And that means that in order for the species to survive, we have had to develop powerful instincts to protect the young and to feed them. We have a genetic imperative to assure the survival of those who are carrying our genes. The goal of universal religion is, in short, to expand this circle of caring, to embrace all of humankind. But it is a tough sell. Humankind is a very abstract notion, and we will not be able to bring all 7 billion people of the world before our mind's eye. Yet, however difficult it may be emotionally and practical, I have no problem declaring that religious people have a moral obligation to do what we each can to eliminate hunger in the world, to try to ensure that every person on this planet has a secure and healthy supply of food sufficient to their needs. This is a worthy moral goal. What I'm less sure of is the best way to achieve that goal is to call food a human right. Partly, this is because I'm hung up on my legal training, which teaches that every legal right possessed by one person has a corresponding legal duty in someone else. Let's say you and I have a contract to deliver a truckload of apples in a week. My legal right is to have the apples on the day of delivery. Your legal duty is to deliver them. Some of you will already begin to see why so-called negative rights are easier to sustain in this legal tradition than the affirmative rights contained in the Universal Declaration and its daughter documents. For it is easy to say that everyone has a right to food, but if every right entails a corresponding duty, whose duty is it to supply the food? Most of the developed world has now answered that question by saying it is the duty of all of us in each of our countries, expressed through governments, their regulatory and their taxing powers. All developed nations except the U.S. have ratified the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. The UN's rapporteur, Olivier de Schutter, argues that recognizing a human right to food is not just government giving out food to the hungry. It is forcing governments to give feeding people a high priority in all the policy decisions it makes. Quote, unless you increase political pressure on governments, unless you ensure that those in need participate in identifying the solutions to the obstacles they face and play an active role in monitoring progress, nothing will change. This is a core idea of the right to food. It is based on the recognition that you cannot work for people without people. Frank reminds me just before the service that the Irish potato famine was a disaster that did not have to happen. It was caused as much by economic allocation decisions and by imperialistic aims as it was by Mother Nature. And that probably is true of most major food shortages, that there's going to be a human element in almost anything you look to. So the abstract concept of, well, we can't have the government feeding people is really not the way to look at it. The way to look at it is, let's get government out of the way of being between people and their food. Let's make sane policy, economic policy, with the feeding of the people as a high priority. If this amounts to calling food a human right, or just the Congress should calling food a human right, I'm prepared to sign on to that. And I think that's what the UN is saying to us, that if the U.S. could endorse this, we would get an awful lot further down the road to seeing that nobody in the world goes hungry. So, my prayer is, may each of us this day, each person on this planet, be given our daily bread. Amen.